Hastinapura, the Kuru Dynasty that created the Mahabharata. Act 1, The City on the Ganga. There is a quiet that rests upon the upper reaches of the Gangetic plain, where the great river sweeps down from the foothills of the Himalayas and flows across the fertile expanse of northern India. Today, near the modern district of Meerut in Uttar Pradesh, the river has shifted its course, leaving behind ancient mounds, buried brickwork, and silent fields. But 3,000 years ago, this land was the beating heart of an empire. This was Hastinapura, the Elephant City. It was not merely a settlement of stone and timber, it was an idea. In the memory of ancient India, Hastinapura was the seat of the Kurush, a clan whose name was synonymous with order, virtue, and imperial authority. To hold the throne of Hastinapura was to hold the center of the civilized world, to stand as the guardian of dharma, the cosmic and social order that bound gods, kings, and commoners alike. Yet, the civilization that built Hastinapura did not fall to foreign invaders. It did not crumble under the weight of flood or famine. It consumed itself from within. The catastrophic conflict known to history and sacred tradition as the Mahabharata, a war that would shatter the martial elite of an entire subcontinent, did not begin on the blood-soaked field of Kurukshetra. It began in the quiet corridors, the sacred altars, and the royal chambers of Hastinapura. It was built slowly, brick by brick, generation by generation, through a long series of moral compromises, tragic vows, unyielding pride, and misplaced loyalties. To understand the ruin of the Kuru dynasty, one must look past the battle lines and the divine weapons. One must look at the human beings who inherited a great legacy and found themselves trapped by the very laws designed to preserve it. The story of Hastinapura is the story of how good men, acting out of what they believed to be duty, paved the road to total annihilation. Act 2, The River and the Vow. The long descent into tragedy began generations before the war, during the reign of King Shantanu. He was a sovereign of great renown, descendant of the legendary King Bharata, ruling over a prosperous realm. But the destiny of his house was altered forever on the banks of the river Ganga. It was there that Shantanu encountered a woman of ethereal beauty. She was Ganga, the divine river incarnate in human form. Captivated by her presence, the king sought her hand in marriage. She agreed, but attached a single, unyielding condition: he must never question her actions, no matter how cruel or incomprehensible they might appear. Should he ever break this promise, she would leave him forever. Driven by desire, Shantanu accepted. What followed was a nightmare concealed within a royal marriage. One by one, as Ganga gave birth to 7 sons, she took each newborn infant to the river's edge and drowned them in the current. Shantanu watched in silent agony, bound by his solemn pledge. He could say nothing, lest he lose the woman he loved. The narrative tradition explains this horrific ritual through the lens of divine destiny. The children were the 8 Vasus, celestial beings cursed to be born on earth, and Ganga was liberating them from mortal existence. But to the mortal eyes of King Shantanu, it was an unbearable horror. When the 8th child was born, Shantanu could no longer contain his grief and outrage. As Ganga approached the water, he cried out, demanding that she spare the infant. The promise was broken. Ganga stayed her hand, preserving the child, but her time with Shantanu was at an end. She revealed her true identity and the cosmic necessity behind her actions. She took the newborn prince with her into the celestial realms, promising to return him to his father once he was fully trained in the arts of statecraft, philosophy, and warfare. Shantanu returned to his palace a broken man, his heart burdened by loss and the heavy silence of an empty throne. Years passed. The king ruled dutifully, though the joy had left his reign. Then, one day along the riverbank, Shantanu witnessed a young man of extraordinary martial skill using his arrows to dam the flow of the Ganga. It was his son, returned to him. Ganga appeared once more, presenting the youth to the king. His name was Devavrata. Devavrata was everything a kingdom could desire in an heir. He had been tutored by the greatest sages and warriors of the age, instructed in law by Vishvamitra, in statecraft by Brihaspati, and in the supreme arts of archery by Parashurama himself. He was virtuous, majestic, and universally beloved by the ministers and the populace. Shantanu joyfully anointed Devavrata as the Yuvaraja, the crown prince of Hastinapura. The future of the Kuru dynasty seemed secure. But peace in Hastinapura was always fragile. Sometime later, while hunting near the Yamuna River, Shantanu encountered Satyavati, the daughter of a chieftain of fisher folk. She was a woman of extraordinary grace, possessing a fragrant aroma that filled the air. Once again, the king was overcome with intense longing. He went to her father to ask for her hand in marriage. The chieftain of the fisher folk was a shrewder politician than the king anticipated. He knew the value of his daughter's hand. He agreed to the marriage, but only on one condition: the son born from Satyavati's womb must inherit the throne of Hastinapura. Shantanu was devastated. To grant such a condition would mean disinheriting Devavrata, his noble, firstborn son, who had done no wrong and was the rightful heir by every standard of law and tradition. Unwilling to commit such an injustice, Shantanu refused the condition and returned to his capital. But he fell into a deep melancholy, abandoning his royal duties, wasting away in his private chambers. Devavrata soon learned of his father's suffering. Seeking out the cause, he approached the chieftain of the fisher folk himself. Devavrata offered to renounce his claim to the crown, promising that Satyavati's son would rule. The chieftain, however, raised a deeper concern. "You may give up your claim, brave prince," he said, "and I know you will keep your word. But what of your sons? When you marry and have children of your own, will they not claim the throne that was once their father's? Will they not wage war against my daughter's children?" Devavrata realized the terrible depth of the dilemma. The only way to grant his father peace and secure his father's happiness was to eliminate any possibility of a future succession war. Standing before the gods, the elements, and the witnesses of the court, Devavrata took an oath that sent a shudder through the cosmos. He swore not only to renounce the throne of Hastinapura, but to remain celibate for the rest of his life, taking no wife and fathering no children. It was an oath of absolute self-denial, taken out of fierce filial love. From the heavens, flowers fell, and a voice echoed, "Bhishma! Bhishma!" The one of terrible resolve. Overjoyed and grief-stricken by his son's sacrifice, King Shantanu granted Bhishma a divine boon, Ikam Ritu, the power to choose the exact moment of his own death. He would not die until he himself willed it. This moment is celebrated in tradition as the ultimate act of devotion. Yet, viewed through the cold lens of statecraft, Bhishma's vow was the foundational tragedy of the Kuru house. By removing himself from the succession, Bhishma created an irreparable political void. He stripped the kingdom of its most qualified ruler and spent the rest of his long life bound to an empty throne, compelled by his oath to protect whoever wore the crown of Hastinapura, regardless of their virtue, wisdom, or capacity to rule. The vow that was meant to prevent a succession crisis had laid the groundwork for a far greater catastrophe. Act 3. The Fragile Lineage. Shantanu married Satyavati, and in time, she bore him two sons, Chitrangada and Vichitravirya. Shortly after, the old king died, leaving Bhishma as the regent of the realm, protecting the young princes and managing the state. The fragility of the lineage showed itself immediately. The elder prince, Chitrangada, was proud and warlike. While still a youth, he engaged in a battle with a king of the Gandharvas who shared his name, and was killed on the battlefield. The crown passed to the younger son, Vichitravirya. But Vichitravirya was frail, sickly, and still a minor. Bhishma continued to govern as regent, seeking suitable brides to ensure the continuation of the family line. Learning of a Swayamvara, a ceremony where princesses choose their husbands, being held by the king of Kashi for his three daughters, Amba, Ambika, and Ambalika, Bhishma rode to the city. Exercising his formidable martial power, he single-handedly defeated the assembled kings and abducted the three sisters, bringing them back to Hastinapura to marry his young stepbrother. This act of raw power carried a bitter sting. The eldest princess, Amba, revealed to Bhishma in private that she had already pledged her heart to Salva, the king of Sorba. Recognizing the sanctity of her choice, Bhishma permitted her to leave and go to Salva. But when Amba reached Salva's court, the king rejected her. He declared that having been abducted and won by Bhishma in open combat, she now belonged to the Kuru patriarch. His pride would not allow him to accept another man's prize. Humiliated and heartbroken, Amba returned to Hastinapura and demanded that Bhishma marry her himself, arguing that he was the one who had destroyed her life. Bhishma refused. His vow of celibacy was absolute. Trapped between a suitor who rejected her and a captor who hid behind a vow, Amba's grief transformed into a cold, consuming hatred. She renounced her royal life, took up severe austerities in the wilderness, and swore an oath that she would one day be the cause of Bhishma's death. Through extreme penance, she was eventually reborn as Shikandi, the child of King Drupada, a figure destined to stand before Bhishma on the fateful field of Kurukshetra. Meanwhile, in Hastinapura, the remaining two sisters, Ambika and Ambalika, were married to Vichitravirya. But the young king's health deteriorated rapidly, and before he could father an heir, he succumbed to consumption. The Kuru dynasty was once again on the brink of absolute extinction. The throne was vacant. The line of Shantanu had failed. In desperation, Queen Mother Satyavati turned to Bhishma. She pleaded with him to set aside his vow, marry the widows of his stepbrother, and father heirs to save the realm. Bhishma stood firm. To break his vow, even for the survival of the state, was to violate his dharma. The sky might fall, the earth might split, but Bhishma would not break his word. With no options remaining, Satyavati was forced to invoke an ancient custom, niyoga, a legal provision under strict sacred law wherein a brother or a designated ascetic could father children with the widow of a childless king to preserve the royal line. Satyavati revealed a secret she had kept since her youth. Before her marriage to Shantanu, while working as a ferrywoman, she had met the great sage Parashara and born a child in secret, a child named Krishna Dvaipayana, who grew up to become the revered compiler of the Vedas, known to history as Vyasa. Vyasa was summoned from his mountain retreat. He arrived at the palace, unkempt, severe, radiating the intense, terrifying spiritual energy of his ascetic life. When Ambika was sent into the chamber to receive the sage, she was so paralyzed with terror at his wild appearance that she squeezed her eyes shut throughout the union. Vyasa emerged and declared to Satyavati, "She will give birth to a son of immense strength and wisdom, but because she closed her eyes, he will be born blind." This child was Dhritarashtra. Dissatisfied with this outcome, Satyavati sent the second widow, Ambalika, into the chamber. But Ambalika was so overcome with fear that she turned deathly pale. Vyasa declared, "This child, too, will be a great warrior, but his skin will be pale, and he will suffer from weakness throughout his life." This child was Pandu. Desperate for a child without flaw, Satyavati ordered Ambika to return to Vyasa's chamber for a third night. But Ambika, unable to face the terrifying sage again, secretly dressed her maidservant in royal garments and sent her in her place. The maidservant received Vyasa with deep reverence, calm, and devotion. Vyasa declared that this woman would give birth to a son of incomparable virtue, wisdom, and righteousness. This child was Vidura. Thus, the next generation of the Kuru dynasty was born. But behind the royal titles lay a profound political irony. None of these three brothers carried a drop of Shantanu's or Bhishma's blood. The imperial line that claimed descent from the moon god was now kept alive through the ascetic seed of a wandering sage and the womb of a fisher folk princess. The illusion of royal purity was maintained, but the political foundation was growing increasingly fragile. Act 4, Two Kings, Two Shadows. As the three boys grew to manhood under the tutelage of Bhishma, their distinct natures became clear. Dhritarashtra possessed immense physical strength, capable of crushing iron with his bare hands. But he was born blind. Pandu was skilled in archery and statecraft, though pale and physically fragile. Vidura grew to be the greatest legal mind of his age, a master of dharma, but his mother had been a maidservant, belonging to the Shudra Varna. When the time came to name the king of Hastinapura, a bitter constitutional crisis emerged. By right of primogeniture, Dhritarashtra was the eldest and should have received the crown. But according to the long-established law of the Kurush, a ruler must be physically whole to perform the sacred rituals of state and lead armies in battle. A blind man could not hold the royal scepter. Vidura, speaking as the chief minister, made the legal decree. Dhritarashtra was disqualified by his blindness. The crown was placed upon the head of Pandu. Dhritarashtra submitted publicly, but internally, a deep, festering resentment took root. He felt robbed of his birthright by a physical limitation he had not chosen. He believed that the world, his family, and law itself had conspired against him. He was given the honors of royalty, but denied its true power. He moved through the gilded halls of Hastinapura carrying an invisible, insatiable hunger for the validation that only the throne could provide. Dynastic alliances were soon arranged to consolidate the realm. For Dhritarashtra, Bhishma secured the hand of Gandhari, the princess of Gandhara, a kingdom located in the far northwest, around modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. When Gandhari arrived in Hastinapura and learned that her husband was blind, she took a profound step. She took a long silk cloth and bound it firmly over her own eyes. Popular tradition often portrays this as an act of selfless devotion, a wife choosing to share her husband's darkness. But within the subtle political atmosphere of the epic, it carries a darker undertone. It was also an act of protest, a stark, visual reminder of the injustice done to her husband, and a self-imposed barrier that isolated both of them from the moral reality of the court. Panda married two princesses, Kunti, the adopted daughter of King Kuntibhoja of the Yadava clan, and Madri, the sister of King Shalya of Madra. With Panda on the throne, Hastinapura enjoyed a brief golden age. Panda was an ambitious military commander. He led the Kuru armies on great campaigns, subjugating neighboring realms and expanding the empire's influence. Wealth flooded into the capital, and the people rejoiced. Then, at the height of his glory, Panda suffered a tragic downfall. While hunting deep in the forest, Panda saw two deer mating in the brush. He fired two swift arrows, killing them. But these were no ordinary deer, they were a powerful sage named Kindama and his wife, who had assumed animal form to engage in love. As the sage lay dying, he pronounced a terrible curse upon the king. Because you have slain a couple in the moment of their love, you too shall meet your death the moment you unite with a woman in passion. The curse struck Panda like a thunderbolt. A king without the ability to father children was politically ruined, a man under the shadow of sudden death was broken in spirit. Overcome with shame and guilt, Panda renounced his royal life on the spot. He refused to return to Hastinapura, stripping off his royal garments and taking up the life of an ascetic in the high mountains of the Himalayas. Kunti and Madri insisted on following him into the wilderness. In Hastinapura, the sudden abdication of Panda created a power vacuum. With no other choice, the court named Dhritarashtra as regent, placing the administration of the realm in his hands. The blind prince finally sat upon the throne he had lusted after for so long, but he ruled only as a caretaker, waiting to see who would produce the first legal heir to the Kuru Empire. In the mountain wilderness, Panda despaired of dying without a son to perform his funeral rites and carry forward his lineage. Seeing her husband's distress, Kunti revealed a secret she had kept since her girlhood. As a young maiden, Kunti had served the short-tempered sage Durvasa with deep care. Pleased by her devotion, Durvasa had granted her a secret mantra, a sacred invocation that allowed her to call upon any celestial deity and bear a child carrying that deity's divine qualities. Panda urged Kunti to use this power for the sake of the kingdom. First, Kunti invoked Dharma, the god of cosmic justice and law. She gave birth to Yudhishthira, a child destined to be steadfast in truth, moral clarity, and righteousness. Second, at Panda's urging, she invoked Vayu, the god of the wind and physical power. She gave birth to Bhima, a child of colossal strength and insatiable vitality. Third, she invoked Indra, the king of the gods and master of celestial warfare. She gave birth to Arjuna, a child destined to become the greatest archer and supreme warrior of his age. Generous in spirit, Kunti shared the sacred mantra with Panda's second wife, Madri. Madri invoked the twin gods, the Ashvins, and gave birth to Nakula and Sahadeva, twins famed for their extraordinary beauty, wisdom, and mastery of horses and swordsmanship. These were the 5 Pandavas, born in the quiet isolation of the mountains, raised among hermits and sages, yet carrying the divine lineage of the gods and the legal lineage of King Panda. Meanwhile, back in the palace of Hastinapura, Gandhari's womb had carried a pregnancy for 2 long years, yielding nothing. When news reached the court that Kunti had given birth to Yudhishthira, securing the primary claim to the imperial succession, Gandhari was overcome with despair and frustration. In a fit of rage, she struck her own abdomen with an iron rod. What issued from her womb was not a child, but a hard, lifeless mass of flesh. Horrified, Gandhari was about to throw it away when the sage Vyasa appeared. He instructed her to divide the mass into 101 pieces and place each piece into a jar filled with ghee and divine herbs. Gandhari obeyed. In time, from these jars emerged 100 sons and one daughter. The eldest of these brothers was Duryodhana, the unyielding warrior, or he who is difficult to overcome. At the exact moment of his birth, evil omens filled the city of Hastinapura. Jackals howled in the courtyards, donkeys brayed, and violent storms swept across the Gangetic plain. Vidura and the wise ministers went before Dhritarashtra and gave a stern, chilling warning. "O king, this child brings the destruction of our line. For the peace of the realm, for the survival of the Kurush, sacrifice this one child. Abandon him, and save your family." It was a cold, pragmatic political calculation, permitted under traditional law, sacrifice an individual for the preservation of the clan. But Dhritarashtra, blinded not just in his eyes but in his heart by intense, long-denied fatherly affection, refused. He could not bring himself to abandon his firstborn son. He held the child tight, naming him his heir in his heart. Not long after, in the distant Himalayas, springtime arrived. The forest was ablaze with blossoms. Pandu, overcome by sudden, uncontrollable desire at the sight of Madri, forgot the sage's curse. He embraced her, and in that moment, the curse took its toll. Pandu fell dead upon the forest floor. Overcome with grief and holding herself responsible for the king's death, Madri chose to ascend Pandu's funeral pyre, entrusting her twin sons to Kunti. Kunti was left alone in the wilderness with 5 young boys. Gathering her courage, she turned her steps back toward the city she had left years before. The gates of Hastinapura opened, and Kunti walked through, bringing the orphan princes into the grand, treacherous world of the Kuru court. The 2 branches of the family, the 5 Pandavas and the 100 Kauravas, were finally under the same roof. The fuse had been lit. Act 5, Venom in the Royal Court. The childhood of the princes was not an era of cousinly affection, it was a breeding ground for hatred. The young Pandavas, hardened by their early life in the mountain wilderness, were physically superior, athletic, and naturally talented. Bhima, with his immense strength, delighted in rough sports, frequently pulling the Kaurava brothers out of trees, wrestling them to the ground, and teasing them mercilessly. To Bhima, it was childish play. To Duryodhana, it was an intolerable humiliation. Duryodhana possessed an acute, hypersensitive pride, inherited from a father who felt perpetually cheated by destiny. He looked at the 5 sons of Pandu not as brothers, but as usurpers, intruders who had come from the wilderness to steal his inheritance. If Yudhishthira was acknowledged as the eldest prince, the crown of Hastinapura would bypass Duryodhana forever. This festering hatred was nurtured by his maternal uncle, Shakuni, the prince of Gandhara. Shakuni had left his distant homeland to live in Hastinapura, embedding himself in Duryodhana's inner circle. Shakuni was a master of psychological manipulation, a man who saw the fault lines in the Kuru royal family and systematically widened them. He fed Duryodhana's insecurities, transforming his jealousy into calculated malice. While still young boys, Duryodhana launched his first murder attempt. He invited Bhima to a feast at the edge of the river Ganges at a place called Pramanakoti. There, he offered Bhima sweetmeats poisoned with Kalakita, a deadly lethal toxin. When Bhima fell unconscious, Duryodhana bound his limbs with vines and threw his body into the deep river currents. Bhima survived through extraordinary fortune, sinking to the realm of the Nagas, where his body neutralized the poison and he was given an elixir that multiplied his strength tenfold. He returned to Hastinapura alive and unharmed. Kunti and the Pandavas, warned by Vidura, realized the depth of the danger surrounding them. Yet, they kept silent, knowing they lacked the political power to openly accuse the king's favorite son. The palace became a court of forced smiles and concealed daggers. To refine the princes into commanders, Dhritarashtra engaged Dronacharya as the supreme master of martial arts for the royal house. Drona was a complex, tragic figure. A Brahmin by birth, he possessed the supreme martial knowledge of the Kshatriya class, handed down to him by Parashurama. but he was driven by a deep, personal humiliation. In his youth, he had been the friend of Drupada, who later became the king of Panchala. When Drona, living in desperate poverty, had gone to Drupada to ask for help, Drupada had insulted him, declaring that friendship could only exist between equals, between kings and kings, not between a monarch and a beggar. Drona came to Hastinapura seeking wealthy royal pupils who could one day serve as his instrument of vengeance against Drupada. In the training grounds of Hastinapura, Drona found his ideal instrument in Arjuna. Impressed by Arjuna's absolute discipline, focus, and single-minded devotion to archery, Drona made a solemn promise: he would make Arjuna the greatest archer in the world, unequaled by any living warrior. This single-minded devotion had a dark, ruthless side. When Ekalavya, a young prince of the Nishada tribe, a forest-dwelling indigenous people outside the high Vedic social hierarchy, came to Drona begging to learn archery, Drona refused him, unwilling to teach a non-royal. Undeterred, Ekalavya constructed a mud statue of Drona in the forest, revering it as his teacher, and practiced relentlessly until his skill surpassed even that of the royal princes. When Drona discovered Ekalavya's extraordinary ability, he realized his promise to Arjuna was threatened. Returning to the forest, Drona demanded his guru daksina, the traditional payment owed to a master. He asked for Ekalavya's right thumb. Without a moment's hesitation, the young warrior drew his knife, severed his thumb, and placed it at Drona's feet. Arjuna remained supreme, but the moral fabric of the Kuru court had frayed further. The climax of the prince's education came with the grand tournament of Hastinapura, a massive public spectacle designed to showcase the skills of the Kuru princes to the court, the citizens, and the elders. In the arena, Arjuna dazzled the crowd. He created fire with his arrows, brought forth water, vanished into mist, and struck distant targets with impossible precision. The crowd roared in adoration. Bhishma wept with pride. Dhritarashtra smiled, though his heart sank at the public glory of Pandu's son. Then, just as the tournament was drawing to a close, a sound like thunder echoed from the entrance of the arena. A young stranger walked into the light. He carried himself with the majesty of a lion, wearing radiant golden armor that seemed fused to his skin, and golden earrings that illuminated his face. It was Karna. Unbeknownst to anyone present, Karna was Kunti's firstborn son. As an unmarried maiden, Kunti had tested sage Durvasa's mantra by invoking Surya, the sun god. When the god appeared, she was terrified and begged him to leave, but the divine law could not be undone. Karna was born to her in secret, bearing the golden armor and earrings of his divine father. Panic-stricken by social shame, Kunti had placed the infant in a basket and set it floating down the Ashwa river. The child was found and adopted by Adhirata, a charioteer of the Kuru court, and his wife Radha. Karna grew up raised by a charioteer, but carrying the fierce, undeniable soul of a cosmic warrior. Standing in the grand arena of Hastinapura, Karna pointed his bow at Arjuna and matched every one of his miraculous feats with effortless grace. The arena erupted in astonishment. Karna stepped forward and challenged Arjuna to single combat to prove who was the true master of the bow. As Arjuna stepped down to accept, Kripacharya, the family priest, stepped between them. He invoked the strict laws of Kshatriya combat. "This is Prince Arjuna of the royal house of Kuru. Before you can challenge him, young stranger, you must declare your lineage and your kingdom. Princes do not fight men of unknown birth." Karna stood frozen. He could not name a royal house. His head dropped in profound, agonizing humiliation. The crowd murmured. Bhima openly mocked him, calling him the son of a whip driver, telling him to stick to reins and horses. In that moment of absolute humiliation, Duryodhana saw his opportunity. With brilliant political instinct and genuine generosity, Duryodhana stepped forward into the center of the arena. He raised his hands and declared, "If heroism requires a crown, then I bestow one upon him this very moment." Calls were made, water was brought, and right there in the sight of the court, Duryodhana anointed Karna as the king of Anga, a tributary kingdom under Hastinapura's control. Overcome with profound gratitude, Karna fell at Duryodhana's feet, asking how he could ever repay such a gift. Duryodhana embraced him and replied, "I ask only for your friendship." In that moment, an unbreakable bond was forged. Duryodhana gained what he desperately needed, a supreme warrior capable of standing equal to Arjuna. Karna gained what he had sought his entire life, recognition, dignity, and a brother who stood by him when the world cast him out. Karna's loyalty to Duryodhana became absolute, blind, and unwavering, a noble virtue tied to a deeply tragic cause. Act 6, Fire and Ashes. With the tournament concluded, the question of succession could no longer be delayed. Yudhishthira had reached legal age. He was universally respected by the elders for his moral integrity, his knowledge of law, and his deep humility. Pressured by Bhishma, Vidura, and the popular demand of the citizens, Dhritarashtra was forced to perform the official ritual naming Yudhishthira as the Yuvaraja, the crown prince of Hastinapura. For Duryodhana, this was the ultimate defeat. He went to his father in private, his voice dripping with anger and despair. "Father, if Pandu's son takes the crown, his son will inherit it after him, and his son after that. We and our children will become servants in our own house, dependent on their mercy. You were the eldest, yet you were passed over. Will you allow your own son to be cast into the dirt?" Dhritarashtra was torn between his knowledge of legal right and his blind affection for his son. In the dark silence of his chambers, the king succumbed. He agreed to a conspiracy. The Pandavas were persuaded to travel to the town of Varanavata under the guise of attending a religious festival. Duryodhana arranged for his minister, Purokanna, to build a grand royal palace for their stay, the Lakshagriha, the House of Lak. The palace was a masterpiece of architectural treason. Its walls were constructed from highly flammable materials, lak, resin, fat, straw, and clarified butter, concealed under a beautiful coat of plaster. The plan was simple: once the Pandavas and Kunti were asleep inside, the palace would be set ablaze. It would appear as a tragic accidental fire, leaving Duryodhana's path to the throne completely clear. But Vidura's intelligence network was vast. Before the Pandavas departed, Vidura spoke to Yudhishthira at the city gates, using a cryptic, dialect-based riddle that only Yudhishthira understood. He who knows the mind of his enemy knows that fire cannot burn a creature that hides underground like a rat. Reaching Varanavata, Yudhishthira inspected the palace and immediately understood the danger. Acting with absolute secrecy, the Pandavas hired a trusted miner sent by Vidura to dig a subterranean tunnel from the center of the palace leading out beyond the town walls into the deep forest. On a dark night, realizing that Purokanna was preparing to strike, Bhima set fire to the palace himself. The Lakshagriha exploded into a roaring inferno. As the structure collapsed into ash, the Pandavas and Kunti slipped down into the dark earth, escaping through the tunnel into the night. The next morning, the charred remains of the palace were searched. The bodies of Purokanna and an unfortunate forest woman and her 5 sons, who had taken shelter in the palace hall, were found burned beyond recognition. News reached Hastinapura: the Pandavas were dead. In the royal court, Dhritarashtra wept tears of public grief, ordering elaborate funeral rites, while secretly rejoicing. Duryodhana believed he had finally won. The throne was his. Deep in the wilderness, the Pandavas lived as hunted fugitives, disguised as poor Brahmin mendicants. They wandered through dense forests, facing demons and hardship. It was during this period that Bhima slew the demon Hidimba and married his sister, Hidimbi, fathering a powerful demon-born son, Ghatotkacha. Then, word reached the wandering brothers of a great event in the powerful kingdom of Panchala. King Drupada was holding a Swayamvara for his daughter, Draupadi, also known as Yajnasini, she who was born from the sacrificial fire. Draupadi was no ordinary princess. She had emerged fully grown from a sacred fire altar alongside her brother Drishtadyumna, created by the gods to bring about the destruction of the old order and the purification of Dharma. The Pandavas traveled to Panchala, still wearing the simple cotton robes of Brahmins, and sat among the crowds of spectators. King Drupada had constructed an extraordinary test for his daughter's suitors. A massive, unyielding steel bow was placed in the center of the hall. High above, a revolving target, a golden fish, was suspended behind a spinning wheel. The suitors had to string the bow and, looking only down at the target's reflection in a bowl of oil on the floor, shoot 5 arrows through the spinning wheel to strike the eye of the fish. King after king failed. Powerful warriors could not even bend the heavy steel bow, many were thrown backward in humiliation. Karna stepped forward. He lifted the bow with effortless ease and was about to string it when Draupadi spoke out from the dais, "I will not choose the son of a charioteer." Karna froze. The sting of his unknown birth struck him once again in public. With a bitter laugh, he cast the bow down and walked away. Then, from among the rows of poverty-stricken Brahmins, a young man stepped forward. It was Arjuna, in disguise. The Kshatriya warriors in the hall muttered in anger, "How dare a Brahmin attempt a martial test meant for kings?" But Arjuna walked to the bow, bowed reverently, lifted it without exertion, strung it in a single motion, and looking down at the reflection in the oil, released 5 arrows in swift succession. The golden fish fell to the floor. The hall erupted in chaos. Arjuna led Draupadi out of the arena, bringing her to the modest potter's hut on the outskirts of the city where Kunti was waiting. As they reached the door, Arjuna called out joyfully, "Mother, look what we have brought home today." Without looking up from her prayers, Kunti replied automatically, "Whatever you have brought, my sons, share it equally among the 5 of you." The words were spoken. In the ancient world, a mother's command, especially the word of a queen steeped in truth, could not be revoked without fracturing the moral foundation of the family. To prevent internal division, and recognizing a deeper cosmic destiny at work, the 5 brothers made an unprecedented decision: Draupadi would become the common wife of all 5 Pandavas. This polyandrous marriage was a profound political earthquake. By marrying Draupadi, the Pandavas gained the total military backing of Panchala, the most powerful kingdom in northern India. Furthermore, Krishna, the prince of Dwarka and head of the Yadava confederacy, formally aligned himself with the Pandavas, recognizing their cause as the instrument of divine order. The Pandavas were no longer helpless orphans hiding in the woods. They were a formidable political bloc, backed by the greatest military forces of the age. Word reached Hastinapura that the Pandavas were alive. The news shattered Duryodhana's illusions. In the Kuru court, a fiery debate raged. Duryodhana proposed immediate military action or political assassination to destroy the Pandavas before they could march on Hastinapura. Bhishma, Drona, and Vidura stood up in opposition. They condemned the treachery of the Lakshagriha and warned Dhritarashtra that to go to war against Panchala, Dwarka, and the Pandavas meant the absolute destruction of the Kuru state. They demanded that justice be done. Dhritarashtra, terrified of a civil war that could destroy his family, chose a cowardly compromise. He decided to partition the kingdom. Duryodhana was given the ancient, rich, fully developed capital of Hastinapura and its surrounding prosperous territories. The Pandavas were given Kandavaprastha, a barren, arid, neglected wilderness inhabited by wild tribes, snakes, and demonic forces. It was a deeply unjust division, designed to keep Duryodhana happy while offering the Pandavas just enough to prevent an immediate war. Yet, Yudhishthira accepted the terms in silence, seeking only to avoid bloodshed and preserve the peace of his ancestors. Act 7, The Splendor of Indraprastha. The Pandavas took the desolate wasteland of Kandavaprastha and transformed it into a miracle. With the aid of Krishna and the divine architect Maya, an Asura whose life Bhima had saved during the clearing of the Kandava forest, they built a city that rivaled the abodes of the gods. They named it Indraprastha, the city of Indra. Indraprastha was surrounded by wide moats, soaring white walls, magnificent gardens, and grand avenues. At its center stood the Maya Sabha, an imperial assembly hall constructed of magical, crystalline materials. The hall was full of optical illusions. Solid floors looked like deep, shimmering lakes, actual pools of crystal-clear water appeared as smooth, dry marble, walls seemed like open air, and open doors appeared as solid stone. Under Yudhishthira's wise and just rule, Indraprastha flourished. Merchants, scholars, and warriors flooded into the new capital. Within a decade, Indraprastha surpassed Hastinapura in wealth, prestige, and influence. To formalize his position as a sovereign ruler, Yudhishthira decided to perform the Rajasuya Yajna, the grand imperial sacrifice that declared a king to be a Samrat, an emperor above all other kings. Rulers from across the entire Indian subcontinent arrived in Indraprastha to pay homage, bring tribute, and acknowledge Yudhishthira's supremacy. Even Duryodhana, Karna, and Shakuni came, representing Hastinapura. The ritual was a triumph. The supreme honors of the ceremony were bestowed upon Krishna of Dwarka, who publicly slayed the arrogant king Shishupala of Kedi when he attempted to disrupt the sacrifice, demonstrating both spiritual and military dominance. Yudhishthira was crowned emperor. The sons of Panda had reached the pinnacle of earthly power. After the ceremonies concluded, Duryodhana remained behind to explore the miraculous Maya Sabha. Walking through its halls alone, his mind consumed by envy and bitterness, he fell victim to the palace's optical illusions. Mistaking a smooth crystal floor for a deep pool, Duryodhana pulled up his royal garments to keep them dry, only to find himself walking on hard stone. Moments later, mistaking a real pool of water for solid marble, he stepped forward and plunged directly into the deep water, soaking his royal robes. From the balconies above, the attendants laughed. Popular tradition and modern dramatic adaptations often claim that Draupadi herself laughed from the balcony and uttered the famous, cutting insult, "A blind man's son is also blind." However, the critical editions of the Mahabharata present a more subtle reality. Whether Draupadi uttered those specific words or merely joined in the general laughter of the palace, the effect on Duryodhana was devastating. He felt utterly mocked, humiliated, and exposed in the home of his arch-rivals. He returned to Hastinapura in a state of deep, toxic depression. He refused food, tore out his clothes, and shut himself in his chambers. When Shakuni came to him, Duryodhana poured out his soul. "Uncle, I have seen the wealth of Yudhishthira, and it burns me like fire. The entire world pays homage to him while we sit in Hastinapura like forgotten shadows. I cannot bear to live while my enemies enjoy such glory. I must destroy them, or I will die." Shakuni smiled. He advised against open military conflict, knowing that Arjuna's archery, Bhima's strength, and Krishna's guidance made the Pandavas unbeatable on the battlefield. "We cannot defeat them with swords, my nephew," Shakuni whispered. "We must defeat them with something far more lethal. We must invite Yudhishthira to a game of dice." Act 8, The Hall of Dice. Shakuni was a master of Dayuta, the ancient game of dice. More importantly, he possessed loaded dice, crafted to land on whatever numbers he desired. Yudhishthira had a single, fatal flaw, a secret weakness for gambling. Furthermore, as a Kshatriya king, social etiquette and code dictated that he could not refuse a formal invitation to a challenge issued by his elders. Shakuni and Duryodhana went to King Dhritarashtra. They persuaded the blind king to build a magnificent gaming hall in Hastinapura and issue a formal invitation to Yudhishthira for a friendly game of dice. Vidura immediately recognized the trap. He pleaded with Dhritarashtra. "O king, do not permit this game. It will breed hatred between your sons and the sons of Pandu. It is the door to total ruin." Dhritarashtra, inwardly thrilled by the possibility that his son might gain through gambling what he could never gain through war, overruled his wise minister. "Dharma will protect us," the king muttered weakly, issuing the command. Yudhishthira arrived in Hastinapura with his brothers and Draupadi. When they gathered in the grand assembly hall, filled with the elders Bhishma, Drona, Kripa, Dhritarashtra, and the court ministers, Yudhishthira stepped forward to play. It was then that the trap was sprung. Duryodhana announced that he would not throw the dice himself, his uncle Shakuni would play on his behalf. Yudhishthira hesitated. It was irregular for a proxy to play, but Shakuni baited him, challenging his courage and honor. Yudhishthira accepted. The game began. Stake by stake, Shakuni stripped Yudhishthira of his empire. Yudhishthira wagered his golden chariots, his thousands of horses, his royal elephants, his treasury of jewels, his vast herds of cattle, and the very land of Indraprastha. With every throw of the dice, Shakuni called the numbers, and the dice obeyed. With every loss, Yudhishthira's judgment eroded, replaced by the obsessive desperation of a drowning man. The elders sat in horrified, paralyzed silence. When Yudhishthira had lost all his wealth and kingdom, Shakuni leaned forward and suggested a new stake. "You still have wealth, king. You have your brothers." Systematically, Yudhishthira wagered his family, Nakula, Sahadeva, Arjuna, and Bhima. One by one, the great heroes of the age were lost, becoming slaves to Duryodhana. Then, Yudhishthira wagered himself, losing his own freedom. He sat in the center of the hall, a ruined man, stripped of his crown, his kingdom, his brothers, and his own liberty. Shakuni smiled, delivering the final blow. You still possess one thing of supreme value, Yudhishthira. You have Draupadi, the sweet princess of Panchala. Stake her, and you may yet win back all you have lost. A gasp of horror ran through the assembly hall. Vidura cried out in agony. Bhishma covered his eyes. Yet, trapped in the nightmare of his own weakness, Yudhishthira spoke the words, I stake Draupadi. Shakuni threw the dice. I have won, he announced. What followed is the darkest hour in the history of Hastinapura, the moment the Kuru dynasty lost its moral right to exist. Duryodhana dispatched his younger brother, Dushasana, to fetch Draupadi from her private chambers. Draupadi was in her period of isolation, wearing a single, simple garment. When Dushasana ordered her to come to the public assembly hall as a slave, she refused, asking a profound legal question. Go back to the court and ask the elders, whom did Yudhishthira lose first, himself, or me? If he had already lost himself and become a slave, did he still have the legal right to stake a free woman? Dushasana ignored the question. He grabbed the queen of Indraprastha by her long, dark hair and dragged her forcibly through the public corridors of the palace, pulling her into the assembly of men. Standing in the center of the hall, her clothes stained, her hair disheveled, Draupadi looked at the grand patriarchs of the realm, men revered for their virtue and wisdom, and delivered a fierce, blistering indictment. How can this assembly tolerate such an outrage? Where is the dharma of Bhishma? Where is the wisdom of Drona? Where is the justice of the king? Bhishma hung his head in agonizing helplessness. He stammered a famous, tragic response that revealed the total paralysis of the legalistic mind. The ways of Dharma are subtle and hard to understand, my child. A master may stake his wife, yet a man who has lost himself may no longer own anything. I cannot resolve this legal paradox. Bhishma chose the technicality of the law over absolute moral justice. Drona remained silent out of political obligation to the throne that fed him. Dhritarashtra sat in silence, inwardly exulting as his son achieved absolute power. Only Vidura and the young prince Vikarna, one of Duryodhana's brothers, raised their voices to denounce the act, but they were drowned out. Encouraged by the elders' silence, Duryodhana reached new heights of cruelty. He slapped his left thigh, a deeply offensive gesture, and commanded Draupadi to come sit on his lap as his servant. Dushasana then stepped forward to strip Draupadi of her single garment in front of the entire court, seeking to complete her absolute humiliation. Her husband sat bound by Yudhishthira's vow of honor, unable to lift a weapon. Bhima, his body shaking with rage, swore a terrible vow that echoed through the hall. I swear by my ancestors that I will drink the blood from Dushasana's chest in battle, and I will break the thigh of Duryodhana with my mace. As Dushasana pulled at her garment, Draupadi realized that mortal help had failed her. She released her hold on her clothes, raised both hands to the heavens, and surrendered completely to Krishna, calling upon him with absolute devotion. A divine miracle took place. As Dushasana pulled away cloth, another layer appeared beneath it, then another, and another. Bolt after bolt of endless, shimmering fabric poured from her body. Dushasana pulled until his arms grew numb and he collapsed onto the floor in exhaustion, surrounded by a mountain of cloth, unable to disrobe her. In that moment, loud howling of jackals and terrible omens filled the palace. Gandhari, terrified that her son's outrage would draw down the immediate curse of the gods upon Hastinapura, rushed into the hall. She pleaded with Dhritarashtra to intervene. Frightened by the omens, Dhritarashtra finally found his voice. He stepped forward, praised Draupadi's virtue, and granted her 3 boons. For her first boon, Draupadi asked for the immediate freedom of Yudhishthira. For her second boon, she asked for the freedom of her 4 brothers and their weapons. When Dhritarashtra offered her a third boon, Draupadi refused it with supreme dignity. Greed destroys virtue, O king. A Kshatriya woman is permitted only 2 boons. My husbands, free and armed, will earn the rest. Dhritarashtra restored their kingdom and permitted the Pandavas to return to Indraprastha. The Pandavas departed, but as soon as they left, Duryodhana, Shakuni, and Karna confronted Dhritarashtra once more. They argued that letting the Pandavas go, armed and enraged by their humiliation, was suicide. They insisted on a second, final game of dice, a single throw to settle everything forever. Weak-willed as ever, Dhritarashtra recalled the Pandavas. The terms of the second game were absolute. The loser would relinquish everything and go into exile in the wilderness for 12 years, followed by a 13th year of Agyatavasa, total concealment in society. If they were discovered by Duryodhana's spies during that 13th year, they would have to repeat the entire 13-year exile again. Yudhishthira, bound by his code of honor, sat down once more. Shakuni threw the loaded dice. He won. The 5 Pandavas stripped off their royal garments, dressed in the rough skins of deer, and prepared to leave Hastinapura. Draupadi bound her hair, swearing it would remain unbraided until she washed it in the blood of Dushasana. As they walked through the gates of Hastinapura into the wilderness, the citizens wept, cursing the house of Dhritarashtra. Vidura looked back at the city and declared, "This city has just signed its own death warrant." Act 9, The Unraveling Peace. For 12 years, the Pandavas lived in the harsh wilderness, enduring hardship, encountering sages, and acquiring powerful celestial weapons. Arjuna traveled to the heavens to secure divine armaments from Indra and Shiva, while Bhima and the others deepened their strength and resolve. The 13th year, the year of concealment, was the most dangerous. The Pandavas entered the kingdom of Matsya, ruled by King Virata, and took on humble disguises in his court. Yudhishthira became a court courtier and dice player, Bhima became a palace cook and wrestler, Arjuna transformed himself into Brihanala, eunuch dance master instructing the princess, Nakula worked in the stables, Sahadeva tended the cattle, and Draupadi became Sairandri, a humble maidservant to the queen. Despite Duryodhana's relentless network of spies searching every corner of the continent, the Pandavas completed the 13th year undetected. When the period expired, the Pandavas revealed their true identities to King Virata. With the alliance of Matsya added to Panchala and Dwarka, they formally demanded the return of their kingdom, Indraprastha. Duryodhana refused outright. He claimed that the Pandavas had been discovered before the 13th year had officially ended, a claim flatly rejected by the elders and astronomers of the court, who calculated that the lunar calendar confirmed the full term had been served. The political machinery of northern India began to mobilize for war. Yet, Yudhishthira sought to avoid the massacre of his own family at all costs. He sent diplomatic missions to Hastinapura, pleading for peace. Dhritarashtra sent his trusted charioteer and minister, Sanjaya, as an envoy to the Pandavas. Sanjaya brought a bizarre message from the blind king. He praised Yudhishthira's virtue and urged him to maintain his righteousness by choosing peace, even if it meant living in poverty, rather than waging a bloody war against his cousins. Yudhishthira's response was clear. "We do not seek war, Sanjaya. Give us back our kingdom, and we shall live in peace. But do not ask us to accept tyranny in the name of righteousness." When all diplomatic efforts stalled, Krishna himself offered to go to Hastinapura on a final mission of peace, the Krishna Dutya. Arriving in the capital, Krishna was welcomed with lavish arrangements by Duryodhana, who hoped to win the powerful Yadava leader to his side. Krishna rejected Duryodhana's lavish feasts, choosing instead to stay in the humble home of Vidura, eating simple green vegetables served with pure devotion. The next morning, Krishna entered the grand assembly hall of Hastinapura. He addressed Dhritarashtra, Bhishma, and the court with supreme eloquence. "O king of the Kurush, I come to ask for peace. The destruction of this war will consume your sons, your generals, and the people of this land. Do not let your reign be remembered as the era that slaughtered its own children. The Pandavas are prepared to forget the past. They do not even demand their full empire. Give them just 5 villages, 1 for each brother, and they will lay down their arms and serve you as their sovereign." It was a magnificent, humiliating concession. The Pandavas were willing to trade an empire for 5 humble villages to prevent a global catastrophe. Bhishma, Drona, and Vidura begged Duryodhana to accept this generous offer. Duryodhana stood up in the center of the court, his face twisted with absolute contempt. "I will not yield to Krishna's threats. The Pandavas think they can intimidate me. Hear my final answer, I will not give the Pandavas enough land to pierce the point of a single needle. Krishna looked at Duryodhana with deep pity. You have chosen war, Duryodhana. And war you shall have. Enraged, Duryodhana ordered his guards to seize Krishna and bind him in chains. A collective gasp of terror filled the hall. Krishna laughed, a deep, resonant sound that shook the walls of the palace. In that moment, Krishna revealed his Vishvarupa, his divine, cosmic form, to the assembly hall. The walls seemed to dissolve. The court saw the divine reality, millions of gods, suns, stars, and time itself moving within his infinite body. Blind Dhritarashtra was granted temporary vision to witness the cosmic vision, falling to his knees in terror. The gods filled the hall, and in their jaws, the court saw the vision of the future, Duryodhana, Karna, Bhishma, Drona, and all the armies of Hastinapura being crushed to powder. The vision faded. Krishna walked out of the assembly hall of Hastinapura. The last hope for peace was gone. Before leaving the city, Krishna took Karna for a ride in his chariot. Stopping on the outskirts of Hastinapura, Krishna revealed to Karna the secret of his birth, that he was Kunti's eldest son, born of the sun god, and legally the eldest of the Pandavas. If you come with me now, Karna, Krishna said gently, Yudhishthira will fall at your feet. Bhima will carry your banner. Arjuna will drive your chariot. Draupadi will accept you as her lord. You will be crowned emperor of the world. It was everything Karna had ever dreamed of, legitimacy, royal honor, and total acceptance. Karna closed his eyes. Tears rolled down his cheeks. But he shook his head. I know you speak the truth, Krishna. I know I am Kunti's son. But when I was abandoned, when the world called me a charioteer's son and mocked my birth, it was Duryodhana who took my hand. He gave me a kingdom. He gave me honor. He gave me his heart. For 13 years, he has relied on my bow to fight this war. If I desert him now, I would be a traitor, a coward, a man without honor. I belong to Duryodhana. I must lay down my life in his fire. Karna's tragic choice was made. He chose loyalty over power, friendship over life, and a doom he clearly foresaw over a crown he had not earned through his personal honor. Act 10, The Shadows over Kurukshetra. The armies began to move. From every corner of the Indian subcontinent, from the snowy peaks of Cambodia to the southern tips of Pandya, from the western shores of Dwarka to the eastern kingdom of Pragjyotisha, millions of warriors marched toward the sacred plain of Kurukshetra. Hastinapura, the ancient city on the Ganga, grew quiet. The grand halls were empty of young men. Only the old, the women, and the children remained behind. In his private chambers, King Dhritarashtra sat in total darkness, accompanied only by his loyal secretary, Sanjaya, who had been granted divine vision by sage Vyasa to describe the coming battle word for word to the blind king. The catastrophe was finally at hand. Looking back across the generations, one sees that Kurukshetra was not born of a single moment of madness. It was the accumulated consequence of 100 choices made by human beings who believed they were doing their duty. Bhishma chose the technicality of an oath over the living spirit of justice, binding himself to protect an evil court. Dhritarashtra chose blind, selfish love for his son over his duty as a righteous sovereign. Drona chose personal vengeance and elite patronage over moral leadership, creating weapons for a war he knew was wrong. Yudhishthira chose rigid adherence to the codes of royal gambling and honor over pragmatic moral ethics, gambling away the freedom of his family. Duryodhana chose pride, envy, and absolute power over familial harmony, permitting himself to be consumed by toxic hatred. Karna chose loyalty to a tyrant over truth, using his immense gifts to validate an evil cause. None of these men were simple monsters. They were brave, learned, noble warriors, the elite of their civilization, trapped in a web of competing loyalties, unyielding vows, and moral compromises. They had built a world so bound by rigid rules that it could no longer deliver justice. And when a society can no longer deliver justice, it inevitably delivers war. The sun began to rise over the field of Kurukshetra. The conch shells echoed across the plain. The chariots lined up in massive, terrifying battle formations. On one side stood the 11 armies of Hastinapura, commanded by the great patriarch Bhishma. On the other stood the 7 armies of the Pandavas, guided by the divine hand of Krishna. Between them sat a young prince, Arjuna, suddenly overcome with deep sorrow, dropping his bow to the floor of his chariot, unable to face the slaughter of his own family. The story of the dynasty was over. The story of the Great War was about to begin.